If you've been keeping up with recent tournaments, more specifically the recent European International, then you might be familiar with the term power balance, or at least have seen a power balance team before. So power balance is the term used for a very common team right now, which consists of Palafin, Arcanine, Amoonguss, Fluttermane, and the other two Pokemon have some variants. There's usually a dragon of some sort, and oftentimes the other Pokemon is like a fake out user like Iron Hands or something. And this is currently the meta. The International European Tournament, the final of that tournament, featured two power balance teams that the only difference between them was they had a different dragon type. And I think the movesets might have been slightly different on some of the other Pokemon. The Palafins, however, were very similar. Might even be the same Palafin build. And this is just turning into like the peak meta for the current format. Essentially, if you want to win, you want to build this Palafin team that uses pretty much the exact same core every time. And while that may be true for a very optimal setting, such as you being a very high skill player playing against other high skill players in an open team sheet format, this approach of using the most optimal team possible is oftentimes not the greatest option to go for unless you are that peak performer. So in today's video, I'm going to cover a concept of intentionally building off-meta teams, and how off-meta can sometimes be easier to win with on, say, ranked ladder than an actual peak meta team. So when you take a look at the current Palafin builds right now, especially the ones that are put into power balance teams, they're almost exactly the same. They are built bulky offensive, usually have Mystic Water as their item, and the moveset is almost always the same exact moveset, which is Jet Punch, Wave Crash, Protect, and Haze. And it's actually pretty safe to assume that if you see Power Balance in Team Preview, that is exactly the type of Palafin you're going to run up against. And while it seems reasonable to think, if I want an offensive water-type Pokemon, why not just use the best one that's available, which just so happens to be Palafin right now? And why would you ever use other water types like Dreadnought or even Dondozo when Palafin combined with the Power Balance team is so incredibly strong in the format? And there's several reasons why it might not be ideal for everyone to just pick a Power Balance team and run with it. The most obvious reason is that of predictability. If you are in the lower levels of the ranked ladder, let's say Poke tier and below, oftentimes a really strong competitive team, such as a peak meta rental team, can often run through the lower tiers of ranked ladder quite solidly, because oftentimes the teams you run into there are very suboptimal. So in that instance, a very good consistent team can be quite helpful to just use to get through the lower levels of ranked ladder. However, after a while, you will reach a point where you come across players that know what this team is. And oftentimes players that are higher up in the ranked ladder will have some understanding and keep up with the current meta and what's common to run across. Some of them maybe even watching tournaments on a regular basis, which if they do that, they're going to know that power balance is quite common in the current meta at the time of recording. And if these players watch some of the best players in the world using the power balance team and seeing how they play it, when they come across somebody on ranked ladder that's in like Great Ball tier, Ultra Ball tier, maybe even Master Ball tier, that is running this power balance rental, then this person, having seen how this team plays, possibly even knowing the EV spreads, if they're really that up to date on the current meta and they know this rental, they will have a plan in place to beat power balance teams pretty much all the time. And it's not because a power balance team is bad, in fact it's incredibly strong. But these high-end rental teams are typically only as strong as the player that's using them, which if you're not a pro player at this game, you might find that once you reach a certain level on, say, the ranked ladder, that this high-end rental team just stops working. even though you do all the right things and follow the procedure of how to get the team to work and how to set it up. The problem is, even though you may know how to set it up to a reasonable extent, your opponent does too. And they're just gonna play into that and read you like a book, essentially, which in a best of one scenario can make such otherwise really good teams very hard to play. Now, some people can do it and get away with it. Those are people that play considerably better than me, because I know every time I have tried to use these higher end rentals, I just get read like a book, and most of the time that I see these high end rentals, I read them like a book and it's an easy win. And that is because it's so predictable how a team that you have seen so many times in ranked ladder or in tournament play, you just know what it's gonna do. And that predictability makes it much easier to counterplay than if it just was a random team that somebody put together. And that's not to say every random team that has really weird setups and uses uncommon Pokemon is necessarily good, but for a ranked ladder setting, I don't actually think using a top tier team, especially a rental, is actually the most optimal choice if you're trying to rank up quickly. Unless you're just a top level player, then it really doesn't matter. So what I would propose is that for ranked ladder at the very least, the most optimal kind of team you can build is one that understands meta, but is not a mirror to meta. And just as an example, the recent European International had some pretty interesting teams that showed up. One that I found very odd was a rain team that had a mixed offensive Life Orb Dondozo that was water Terra type, and a rain team that had 3 other water types in that team. And it showed up on the stream and absolutely destroyed their opponent with Surf Dondozo. And then game 2 with Dreadnought of all things. If you look at usage stats, you know that is not ideal. It is not optimal to play into Dondozo's special attack because it is considerably lower than its physical attack. It's also not ideal to use Dreadnought because even though it's pretty fast in rain, Palafin does very similar damage with a priority move and has much better bulk, and doesn't necessarily need rain to be useful. So while Palafin is capable of enabling a more consistent team overall, that is not to say that off-meta picks, sometimes Pokemon that are even not considered that good, such as Dreadnought, can actually perform quite well even at a high level, because while they're not optimal, they're also a lot harder to plan for. And that is where the unpredictability of off-meta designs is what makes off-meta so viable, and oftentimes ideal if you are not a top level player. This is something I have noticed playing rental teams, that I tend to do best with the ones that have a really weird setup or use Pokemon that are just off the radar. Because when you're building a competitive team, you're building it for the current meta typically, and Pal Balance is so good against this meta. But this is Pokemon that we're talking about. And in a game like this, there's a lot of perfectly viable options that go completely underutilized just because they're not being used by high-level players and are not in popular rental teams. So they just go completely unnoticed by the majority of players. Because of this, you can have some reasonably strong Pokemon, let's say like B tier and C tier Pokemon, that while in a tournament environment against a high level player that's using a Pal Balance team, it may not technically be the best option. But in a best of one that doesn't have open team sheet, those kind of bizarre mix-ups can sometimes net you some very easy wins because they're just so hard to predict. And I think Gen 9 is a game that enables more variety and flexibility in teams than any format that we've ever seen. And while yes, there are standardized meta teams that we're starting to see that are doing exceptionally well, there's also still a ton of variety even at high level play with builds that you just wouldn't expect to ever show up in a competitive tournament. and even with open team sheets still perform very well and are still just not something that most people are planning for. Like, who plans for Surf Dondozo? Nobody does. No one has calcs for Surf Dondozo, and so no one builds EV spreads or designs their teams to counter a Surf Dondozo. Yet it could easily outpace a Pala Balance team if played correctly, especially since in front of, say, Arcanine and Amoonguss, that Surf can just ignore Amoonguss's redirection and potentially one-hit that Arcanine if it has enough offense into special attack. And it might even be able to outpace Palafin in a straight-up fight, as long as it's able to get a +2 Wave Crash into Palafin before it can haze. So that is just an example to show how many options there really are in this game, and somewhere between 1 to 5% of these options are fully explored, really. There's just so many different combinations that are impossible to plan around that can give you some really effectively easy wins because your opponent just did not have an answer for it, because it's completely off the radar. Like, just consider how the most common Palafin build doesn't actually run any other attacks than water type attacks, which that would be a problem if Gastrodon was very common in the meta. You just couldn't bring Palafin against Gastrodon if your opponent's team is designed to set up a scenario where it's really good at taking out all the Pokemon that support Palafin and lets Gastrodon just 1v1 Palafin at the end of the match in the late game. A team like that could actually be pretty hard for a Pala Balance team to properly deal with, especially since Pala Balance does not actually have that good of grass type offense. And while in some ways the idea of a lot of players going more towards Pala Balance teams would seem like the meta is starting to get stale, that actually makes it easier to build off-meta teams, because now you know what to plan for. You just plan for Pala Balance and design a team that can just destroy it, that uses the most bizarre builds possible while still being consistent. Because while I think it is optimal to have some off-meta or under-the-radar picks in your team, at least builds that are off-meta in your team, you still do have to make a team that is consistent. And some setups really just don't work right now, and still probably won't work for quite some time. Like belly drum builds, for example, are not very common because they're typically just really hard to set up. It's way easier to just set up Palafin than it is a belly drum Azumarill, for example, because there's a lot of commitment to those stat buffs, and Haze and Clear Smog are so common that even if you were to get the belly drum off, your chances of getting any use out of it is pretty low. So you still have to understand the meta enough to know that some options just straight up do not work, but there's still a lot of creativity and variety on the table, and doing that basically just takes time. Looking at what's common, seeing how you can build your teams to incorporate counters that are just not expected and not easy to plan for. And this kind of team building is more useful for those who have a decent understanding of the game, but are not like the best players out there, because it's helpful to have an understanding of what's currently meta and the ins and outs of how to deal with it, or at least have seen enough play of these peak meta teams that you have a feel for what they do, and you can relatively easily predict how they're going to play out and the kind of off-meta things you can get away with against that kind of team. Which, the more stale a meta becomes, the easier it is to build off-meta teams that counter it, because you're less and less likely to run into these kind of off-meta teams, meaning less and less people plan for them. And there's still some Pokemon that are definitely quite strong that have rarely ever seen use in a competitive format, let alone a tournament, outside of just like the exceptionally low levels where people are going for skill swap on their Slackings. So there is a balance to it where you do have to have options that function in the current meta, but at the same time you don't want it to be cookie cutter meta. And honestly, this game has a lot of like B tier and C tier kind of Pokemon that just never get used. That even if 5 of your Pokemon are, say, very common in the meta that have 5% plus utilization on average, you could still have a 6th Pokemon that is just completely unused and no one knows what it does or what you plan to do with it, and that can net you some really nice wins, even against teams that are otherwise considered peak meta. Because Pokemon plays a lot like a game of chess, with the main difference being meta teams are chess pieces that you know about, and off-meta teams are chess pieces that you look at in team preview and you're like, what does that do? Which, for a mid to moderately high level player, I think that peak meta is off meta. But just meta enough that it's still relatively consistent, but just off meta enough that the majority of teams don't plan for it, and you can just exploit that lack of planning and knowledge and use that to net wins. So if you ever do team building, or even if you just play rental teams, I would highly encourage you to consider teams that seem a bit odd and have some weird options in them. Because while weird options are not always the best thing to go for, there are some weird options that are still pretty consistent and able to function even in what might seem like a meta that's starting to stale. So anyway, I hope this more conceptual type of video was interesting to you. I'll get back to my normal competitive speculation and maybe even some more ranked battle gameplay next week. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and if you have any suggestions of Pokemon that you want to see featured on the channel for, say, competitive speculation of Pokemon that may be coming in DLC or whatever, let me know down in the comments below, and I will see y'all next time.